Summertime always makes me feel lazy, if I'm honest. There's something about long, sunny days that brings out a desire to sit in the shade with a cool drink and a good book. And I'm sure some of this desire to relax in the summer is a result of growing up in Canada, where as a kid, summer really was the time of year when I was free from the constraints of schedules and expectations. The time when I got to run around with my friends and go on picnics and generally have fun before the school year started up again. But the need to rest and relax and rejuvenate doesn't end with childhood. Given the events and stresses of the last year and a half, a lot of us are feeling even more in need of relaxation and rejuvenation at this point. But even in so-called normal time, we all need regular rest. We all need some intentional Sabbath time each day, each week, each year, to renew and strengthen our relationship with God and to put our lives into perspective, as well, of course, as to rest our bodies and our minds. Now, for some reason, this week's gospel reading is a cut and paste job that cuts out the telling of Jesus' feeding of the 5,000, which we hear next week, to focus on the events that precede and follow it. And the first section describes the return of the apostles from their first ministry tour. They've gone out in pairs to do ministry in the villages, and exhilarated and exhausted, they have returned with stories to tell Jesus, thrilling stories, I'm sure, of healings and exorcisms, and probably also stories of failure and rejection. They're tired, probably overstimulated and underfed, and in significant need of rest. And Jesus himself probably needs rest too. The crowds are building with their endless need for healing and help. And so he says to the returned apostles, "Come away with me. Let's get in the boat and sail away from the crowds for a while." He wants to provide them and himself a time of rest and restoration. But the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. So while Jesus invites his disciples to rest, you might notice they don't actually get to do that. According to Mark, Jesus' retreat by boat idea fails. The crowd anticipates his plan, and they follow and get there ahead of him. By the time he and the disciples reach their destination, the crowds are already waiting, and the quiet sanctuary that Jesus seeks is nowhere to be found. Now, I suspect if it was me, I'd be tempted at that point to turn the boat around and try and find somewhere else. But I'm not Jesus. When Jesus sees the crowds, Mark tells us he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he sits them down and begins teaching. Now, our passage then skips over the miraculous feeding of the multitudes that happens when the day's teaching is done. And when we rejoin the narrative, Jesus has once again sent the disciples off in a boat. Vacation attempt, take two. But once again, the crowds find Jesus. As soon as the boat lands at Gennesaret, the crowds are pushing and jostling to get close. They carry their sick to Jesus on mats. They press against him. They beg to just touch the fringe of his robe so they can receive healing. Once again, his response is compassion. Mark says all who touched him were healed. So despite his and the disciples' need for rest and renewal, in both halves of today's reading, Jesus puts aside his plan for self-care and acts out of compassion. Now, the Greek word we translate as compassion comes from the word which literally means guts. Compassion is feeling it in your gut, a visceral response to another's suffering. But compassion is not just a feeling, but something that you do. It's an urge that hits you in the guts and sends you into action for the sake of the other. Now, I suspect we all know that sensation of compassion literally hitting you in the guts. You see someone suffering and it feels like someone gut punched you. But sadly, it's really easy to allow inertia to overcome our compassion, to feel badly for the other, but not to do anything about it, not to act on it, or to do something, but something that's token, that doesn't help in any significant way. But if all we do is feel badly, that's actually not compassion. That's pity. And that's not the example that Jesus is giving us here. So, today's gospel starts off on our need for rest from our labors, but then shifts to focus on compassion for the need of others. Most of you listening to me today live a middle-class life where it's very easy to pass the buck when you see needs. When we look around at our seemingly self-sufficient neighbors or the community around us, it's tempting to tell ourselves that nothing really urgent is at stake. After all, I'm not the last stop. There are governments and agencies who are supposed to look after the suffering. Not much depends on me personally. At least I think we'd like to imagine that's the case. But just because those that we personally usually interact with day by day may not be struggling just to survive or to keep a roof over their head, doesn't mean that there aren't real and pressing needs around us, both in the community right around us and also, of course, in the wider world. And as followers of Christ, having compassion and caring for the needs of others is part of our calling. And this, of course, includes the need for the basics of life, like food and shelter, but also for things like the need for safety, for belonging, for a sense of purpose. And also for something even bigger than that, which includes those basic needs for everyone, but also includes things like justice and peace and true community. In Mark's gospel, Jesus calls this the kingdom of God. All of which, I think, makes it important to ask ourselves what needs we see in the world around us. And once we've seen them, and sometimes you have to actually look, what can we contribute to help those needs, both as an individual, but also together as a community of faith? And it's important to work together as a community because, as today's passage demonstrates, the needs of the world are endless, and we do all need rest and self-care. So when we act as a community, we have the ability to support each other so that none of us individually is pushed past our strength. So perhaps this week's gospel reminds us of the ongoing and necessary tension that we all experience between compassion for the suffering other and compassion for ourselves. There's clearly nothing new or unique about that. Jesus and his disciples obviously lived with that tension too. Today's reading tells us of how Jesus showed compassion for those around him. But the Gospels also tell us that Jesus did find ways to get away, to rest and renew his connection to God, and he did it on many, many occasions. So what does this mean for our lives? Strive for balance, recognize weariness when you feel it. Don't apologize for being a mere human. Take breaks. Yes, absolutely, all of those things. But also remember that we are called by God to help care for those in need. There are urgent things at stake, and sometimes what God asks of us is costly. And while balance between self-care and care of others is, of course, the ideal, it won't always be available, and certainly not always in the short term. Sometimes we have to choose to err on one side or the other. We have to bend ourselves out of that balance. And when that happens, we need to ask ourselves, what direction should we bend in at this moment? If this week's gospel story is our example, then the answer is clear. Err on the side of compassion for the other rather than self. That, after all, is what Jesus did. But eventually you also have to have compassion for your own needs and allow others to show compassion for you.